Hello and welcome back to The Cine Skinny, the film podcast from the people behind the Skinny magazine. It's Jamie Dunn here, and I've broken away once again from the usual Cine Skinny schedule to visit the Glasgow Film Festival, which is currently in full swing. The 20th edition of the film festival kicked off last night in grand style with the UK premiere of Love Lies Bleeding, the blistering second film from St Maud director Rose Glass. It's a wonderfully lurid neo-noir thriller starring Kristen Stewart as Lou, the owner of a grimy gym in Nowheresville, New Mexico. Lou's days are filled with unclogging blocked toilets at the gym and dealing with her family strife. That includes protecting her put-upon sister, played by Jenna Malone, from being bashed around by her vile husband, played by Dave Franco. Lou also has issues with her father, who owns the local shooting ranch and is played by a practically demonic Ed Harris. Lou's life changes for the better when Jackie, a wannabe bodybuilder with a heart of gold, played by Katy O'Brian, walks into her gym and swiftly into her bed. Lou and Jackie's passionate romance is short-lived though, as her dysfunctional family, murky past and roid rage combine to send Lou's life into a tailspin. Love Lies Bleeding is a barnstorming film with a deliciously dark sense of humour that's full of hot sex, brutal deaths and some awesome 1980s needle drops. Before the UK premiere, we sat down with the film's uber-talented director, Rose Glass, to discuss this hugely entertaining 80s noir throwback. Take a listen. So yeah, how are you enjoying Glasgow so far, Rose?
Loving it. I mean, I only got in last night and basically just had a nice dinner at the hotel and drank too much and then went for a long walk this morning to walk it off. It's great. I mean, I only came here once before, I think, when St Maud was at the festival, so it's really nice to be back. I always wish I was staying a bit longer so I actually could look around.
I just wanted to start with, can you remember the initial idea for Love Lies Bleeding? Can you remember if there was a spark or something that kicked it off?
I think it was just wanting to do something about a female bodybuilder. I think that was just the sort of initial thing. It felt like, obviously visually it seemed very striking sort of territory, but also like psychologically kind of potent and interesting. And I guess maybe as someone who's very definitely not a bodybuilder and doesn't have, I think sort of just seemed fascinated by the idea of anybody who manages to have that level of self-discipline and obsessiveness.
And I read that you were actually thinking of setting it in Scotland, in Glasgow actually. Is that...
Well, kind of, there was never like an official draft where it was like that, but when we were because I co-wrote it with Weronika Tofilska, when we were sort of in the brainstorming kind of bit, we were a bit unsure where to set it. To be honest, I think I was very nervous about the idea of doing it in America. And somehow I just felt like I could really imagine versions of these characters being Scottish. I don't know why. And part of me still thinks that would have been great. But I think then as the story started to develop, just logically, it sort of made a lot more sense to put it out in America, just the sort of vastness, I guess. Yeah. And all the guns and stuff like that.
Was it something about the beefy Scottish?
Must have been, exactly. Yeah. I just wanted like some really like muscle-bound butch Scottish lesbians.
You said you were nervous about setting in America. Why do you think that was?
Well, I'm not from there. Obviously I'm not from Scotland, but it's that bit closer. And I'd literally been to America like once or twice, pretty much just when promoting St Maud, and that was just, LA for a few days, so I'd never been to that bit of the country. And also, we ended up sort of leaning into it instead, but I was obviously nervous about the fact that there's just so many famous films that are from that time and era, and sort of, all that kind of visual language of Americana, which almost feels kind of mythological now almost. There's basically so many films which kind of have a toe in the same sort of world that I guess I was just nervous about feeling out of my depth, or like, how do you make it interesting, or how do you make it feel new?
Because I remember when we spoke before for St Maud, you did mention as to your favourite filmmakers were, or who your inspirations were, and you were saying people like David Lynch or David Cronenberg. I know Cronenberg's Canadian, but I think he's American. But like, so it seems like that's your influence. So did you always want to make a film in America? I
mean, I guess it's sort of, America's just such a sort of omnipresent influence on everything. Like, it's all films and TV. Like, there's even if you've never been, that's the weird thing about going to like Albuquerque, for instance, and being in New Mexico. I'd never been before, but everything felt so familiar because you realise you've seen diners in a million films and all this kind of stuff. And probably maybe a lot of European filmmakers have, because of that, there's this sort of almost like siren call of like sort of fascination kind of drawing you towards Hollywood, I guess. It all just feels very like myth-like.
And particularly this genre, like the neo-noir Like, or just the noir in general, it's just such an American genre. It's so cinematic. I'm just wondering, who were your influences with filmmakers or films that you were thinking of while you were writing this and making it?
I think because it is such a kind of because there are so many films which, like I said, have a foot in this time and place. In a way, I tried to not revisit a lot of those films. So, like, I sort of actively didn't revisit stuff like Bound. I'd never seen Thelma and Louise, and I deliberately didn't watch it while we were writing it or making it, because it's one of those ones that's sort of so famous that even if you haven't seen it, you sort of feel like you have, and I'm sure it has an influence on stuff anyway. Or like Wild at Heart, True Romance, I've still never watched. So it was definitely a bit of kind of like putting fingers in your ears and kind of going, la, la, la. Like, all of these films are sort of so influential anyway, it was sort of trying to go the other way. I mean, there were some films, so like, and these were more things that I suggested to the actors to watch. So like after we'd written the script, so more in terms of just trying to get into their heads, the sort of tonal world it might take place in. So I gave them a list which had things like Showgirls and Saturday Night Fever and Crash, which is sort of, I mean, particularly, there's quite like different. Quite different, but there's like, I was like hoping that there's maybe some weird like Venn diagram sort of tiny crossover, and it's like maybe somewhere where those things intersect. And I guess in all the films, there's like, in all those films, there's a real kind of intensity and liveliness to everyone's performances. All of those films in different ways, all the actors feel like they're literally about to sort of burst off the screen somehow, kind of thing. It's all very visceral and energetic. And then I think just to sort of throw them off the idea of it being too 100% American, I think then I also suggested they watch like The Night Porter and The Snake of June, which I don't know if either of them did, but they were just sort of far more left field, subversive, weirdly erotic kind of films, with slightly more, actually no, not European, that's a lie. One of them's Japanese and the other's, I think The Night Porter takes place in Italy. I get that wrong. Anyway, but there's all weird examples of weird erotic relationships.
I guess also those films, or some of them anyway, have got like really morally ambiguous characters. Characters who don't do great things. Is that something that appealed to you writing a film with characters?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I don't think anybody particularly wants to watch. I mean, well, certainly it must be a minority. People don't go to the cinema to watch nice, well balanced, friendly people making sensible choices. It's just not as interesting. And yeah, I think definitely for me, like growing up and like always, I enjoy watching films where you see someone doing the terrible thing, but you understand it somehow. I think that's kind of quite a healthy thing to confront yourself with, maybe. And I guess if the film's about anything, it's all done fairly with a tongue definitely somewhere in its cheek, but the idea that we're all perhaps equally capable of doing terrible and wonderful things. Everyone's kind of got it in them. We all like to think that, I would never do this, I would never do that. That must be very othering of people who do things we don't approve of. But anyway, I don't know. Yes. Waffle, yes. Morally ambiguous characters making mistakes is what I like.
I think the first thing that strikes me about the film, in the first 5 minutes, I sort of thought, my God, I'm seeing a lot of bodies here and a lot of flesh and sweat and pores. And then I realised actually that's something that I actually don't always see in cinema. So sometimes quite sanitised. So it seems something you're quite interested in. It's sort of the body and kind of like its flesh. I think
so. I don't know. I mean, I think that's something I've always been interested in, is kind of bodies and the sort of weird varied relationships people can have with them. And I like sort of cinema, the kind of sort of the nature it sort of lends itself to choreography quite well. And I don't know, just like physical, I've been interested in kind of physical theatre and dance and all that kind of stuff. And probably it was compounded by also then writing it mostly during lockdown, where obviously everything's incredibly sanitized, so it's that bit more enjoyable to find yourself sort of writing as many sort of sweaty, vomiting, bodily fluid kind of scenes as possible. I think just texturally, because coming off the back of St. Maud, that definitely had some sort of grubbiness to it, but the settings were a little bit more kind of like languid and velvet drapes and all this kind of slightly more theatrical fabulousness to it. So I think coming into this, it was almost just the sort of like texture and feel of it was more of a clear thing in my head than necessarily, it's this kind of film, that kind of film. So, something that was more grubby and sweaty and twitchy.
Yeah. And I described it as a noir, but actually at the edges, there's a lot of body horror coming in, which is something that you obviously did previously with St. Maud. Why do you think that's something you come back to?
Body horror. Well, it's like the last one, I guess it's just sort of being interested. That's just sort of what comes naturally and what I'm most interested in, I guess. And the sort of both the connection and disconnection between our brains and bodies, and it's weird that we're sort of, which bit of it actually is us, and we're sort of trapped inside something so physical, but in our brains, I don't know, the disconnect between those two things is quite interesting to me. I think I'd say it's a noir as well. And probably off the back of leaning into some of those sort of, I think me and Vera, when we were writing it, really enjoyed leaning into playing with like the tropes of those kinds of films as well and characters. It was fun leaning into archetypes and then hopefully twisting them into something a bit surprising, hopefully.
How was it co-writing? Is that something you enjoyed?
I loved it. I mean, I'm now starting to write the next thing, which I'm actually doing by myself, but I think no doubt after I've done this, I want to co-write with Vera again. I think it's, it's definitely something I'd consider going forward. I think it kind of depends on the project. I think for this one, it made a lot more sense because it just ended up sprawling and having a lot more characters. And like if I was doing it by myself, I don't think I'd have felt at all confident writing that kind of like the sort of, crime thrillery story is quite complicated to map out. It sprawled into this like family melodrama and all these different dynamics, whereas St. Maud was like basically one or two people. But I loved it because I think St. Maud, like I had a wonderful time making it and it obviously got received really well, which was great. But the writing process, I felt very out of my depth and it was very daunting and very stressful. All that kind of imposter syndrome kind of thing. And you're like, you feel like you're just writing into a void and like, am I just spending all my time writing this thing and it's never going to happen? And without having somebody there with you to bounce ideas off, it's very easy to just sort of spiral down into this sort of dark pit of like, everything's terrible. I hate everything I've written. Whereas with Vera, it was like, she's one of my closest friends anyway. And so a lot of this was just wanting to find ways to entertain each other.
Yeah.
Which was fun.
I also thought Kristen Stewart was fantastic in this as Lou. What qualities were you looking for that character and what does Kristen Stewart bring?
It kind of just felt like a very natural fit, to be honest. Like I just sort of could, once we'd sort of started to imagine what this character was like, and then it was, okay, do the exercise of who your fantasy cast would be. She was kind of the only actress that really sprung to mind and just felt very natural. I mean, because I guess Lou's a bit of she's on some level, I guess, if it's the film noir thing, she's kind of like the sort of morally ambiguous anti-hero who's kind of a bit like haunted by her past and smokes too much and is kind of, and Kristen, I think, embodies that. But there's, I don't know, I just kind of like the idea of her being a bit of like a moody heartthrob as well, but a very neurotic one.
Yeah.
And then there's something also about her and this character which sort of like reminded me a bit of, a friend growing up when I was a teenager. There's something a little bit sort of adolescent about the character as well. And she's very enigmatic, I think, and quite mysterious. And I suppose the character was meant to be someone who who's very kind of closed up and emotionally a bit constipated. She's a bit of a mystery you've kind of got to unpick throughout the film. And I think Kristen's just very good at that. She can sort of convey a lot whilst appearing to do very little, I guess. And she's just incredibly charismatic.
Totally. And was Jackie a trickier prospect? I guess there's not so many actresses who fit the physicality of that character.
Yeah, like I'd said from the beginning that I wanted to find a bodybuilder because it would just be a bit rubbish if she didn't convince in that way. And, that was the whole sort of starting point that had got me excited about doing the film anyway. Because I think there's something undeniable about bodybuilding and getting yourself in that shape. There isn't really a shortcut. So we did inevitably have conversations with like financiers and casting people who were sort of, maybe we could get so-and-so to, start training. And, we've got 4 months maybe they'll get. And it's like, no, it just wouldn't, it takes a lot more than that. But also So I went in being like, we'll find a bodybuilder who's never acted before and is going to be incredible and this will be easy. I'm sure there's loads of them around. And then it turned out that was actually really difficult. So our casting directors just got like 1 million people to tape. And we were seeing bodybuilders, but also like weightlifters, wrestlers, all different kinds of sort of athletes who had the physicality but hadn't acted. And then quite a few actors who maybe had some sort of sporting background. And we could just never find someone who had the performance chops, but then also had the physicality. And then fortunately, scarily close to the shoot, Katy saw an advert for a casting call. I think a fan of hers had sent it to her on Twitter, so I need to find that fan and buy them a drink. But then she contacted us, basically being like, hello, I'm here. Yeah. And it was like, why didn't we hear about you before? And she's been a bodybuilder in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Kate and Kristen, they both have fantastic chemistry. Was that instantaneously? Did they have to work on that together? Or? It's
kind of instant. Like it's... Because we cast Katy not too long before we started shooting. So when they met for the first time, it was, her final audition, this kind of chemistry read thing where she just was reading the scenes with Kristen. And then I think once we were out in Albuquerque, we like read through the script together once, just sort of talked about each scene just to make sure all three of us were on the same page about what's going on between them at any given point. But we didn't really rehearse anything until we were there. They're both just really good actors, I think. And I suppose you sort of hope that if you've cast the right people, the chemistry thing's weird because on the one hand, I think there's a lot of different things that go into it and you can be a bit sort of unromantic about it and be like, yes, it's obviously we cast the right people. It's their performance, and everything to do with like what the sound is doing, how you edit a scene. It's all everything that everyone's doing is like trying to manipulate this fictional scenario. But you sort of, even if you do all that right, I think you just have to sort of pray that there's also this extra little magical spark or something, which there was. And I only really started to see it when we're already shooting and you're sort of watching the rushes at the end of every day. And it was just like, oh, thank God. So that was lucky.
And you set it in, I think it's 89, is that right? Why was that? Why did you choose that period? What
it's the year I was born, so it's all about me. No, it's not. We settled on 89 in the end just because we had to pick a year, because when we see the bodybuilding competition, I was like, we've got to specify it then. But until then, I'd sort of wanted it to be like kind of 80s, kind of 90s, somewhere around then. I mean, I keep saying in interviews stuff like, it was to do with the excess of the 80s about to tip over into nihilistic 90s. But to be honest, which did make sense as well in terms of the film's maybe slightly cynical attitude towards excess and ambition. But it was more to do with just like logistical plotting stuff at first. When me and Vera were just working on the story, it really changes things if you set a film before everyone was on the internet. And I think particularly because we wanted to be that both of these characters felt like real misfits and quite isolated. I guess just the thing of like sort of subcultures and niches and people, before we could all connect on the internet that bit more, I guess it just makes the isolation that both characters have that bit more potent. And it's really annoying if you're trying to make your characters' lives difficult and then they can just whip out their phone and like...
I love that it's a film that centres on a kind of lesbian couple, but none of their issues stem from being gay. Like, was that something that was important to you? That they're
absolutely, yeah, definitely. It's like that was kind of a lot of the reasoning behind it was just not. I mean, there's obviously a lot of very wonderful queer cinema where those things are very much front and centre, and of course, issues of like coming out and all these things that maybe we've seen more in stories, in films. Obviously, that's all well and good, but I think I just personally would like to I'd like to see a queer relationship where the film's not just all about that. It just feels a bit like it's something that's maybe a bit too familiar now. So yes, that was deliberate.
It's also really cool that this, you're very unashamedly queer film full of like hot lesbian scenes is only a film festival. I feel like that wouldn't have really happened sort of 10 years ago even. So like, do you think there's something changed?
I hope so. I mean, I'd like to. Yeah, it's weird because I sort of, all of that kind of side of it, you sort of don't really think about too consciously when you're writing it beyond the fact of let's not make it all about that. So I think me and Vera were just constantly just trying to be led by what was the most interesting version of the story. But I don't know. I mean, I'm curious how it goes down in that respect. And it shouldn't. I like to think that people are just, or a lot of audiences are hopefully just moved past that kind of thing now. Although inevitably, I felt, but it's still the case that if you put a trailer of this on the internet or any clip with Kristen talking in it for that matter, just the amount of horrible like comments that it immediately gets is still pretty disheartening. And maybe when you're in a nice sort of bubble of the film festival and you sort of like forget it a bit. But yes, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that side of it. I'm curious how it's going to go down. Yeah.
How were the reactions of how you sat with an audience yet and watched it?
It's been really fun. I sat in for Sundance and Berlin, and the audience was very vocal in both cases, which is just like the biggest relief as a filmmaker. You just sort of like engineer all these moments, just praying that people will find the same bits funny, and then they actually did. And then I think, Sundance, I think apparently are a notoriously loud audience. So, I mean, I don't know if this will happen every time, but, they were literally like applauding at certain like sort of murders and things happening, like sort of JJ gets murdered and they're like, hooray. So that's very gratifying.
I guess maybe I don't want to spoil anything, but the film does go to quite unexpected places, as did Saint Maud. So it seems like you really enjoy surprising the audience and sort of, bringing in these ideas that you wouldn't find in a kind of typical noir, say. Can you talk about that without revealing too much?
Yes, that. I mean, I think surprising people and surprising yourself can be like the ultimate thrill, really. Particularly if it's surprised in a good way. There's nothing I enjoy more, personally, when I'm watching a film. So I guess that's something you're sort of trying to do. I think it might, I'm sure it'll kind of like divide people a little bit. It seems to have done so far in terms of what they think about the ending. I love it and I'm very proud of it. But yeah, definitely, it was definitely not the easiest sell maybe when we were sort of in the process of financing it and making it, and was quite a daunting. There's something that happens towards the end which was just daunting on all levels in terms of like, how are we going to pull this off practically, like the effects, and tonally it's probably the biggest swing that the film takes, which to me was very exciting. But I figure unless you're sort of like taking risks and risking, I don't know, unless you're taking some risks and taking some big swings, you're not going to make something interesting. So hopefully people like that swing.
That's my time up, but you did mention you were writing something. Are you allowed to say what it is, or is that
no, nothing yet. It's like I'm really like quite early writing it, but I'm really excited about it. But I'm not going to say anything in case I jinx it.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing.
So I'll see you again at the next one.
Yeah, definitely. I hope so.
Nice one.
Thanks, Rose. That's
Cool.
great.
Thank you very much.
So a big thank you to Rose Glass for speaking to us. If you missed Love Lies Bleeding at Glasgow Film Festival, do not worry. The film will be released the 19th of April via Lionsgate. And for more information on what's on at Glasgow Film Festival, head to theskinny.co.uk/film for all our GFF coverage. That's all from me. See you next time. Bye!